pleased to be with you here this evening. And you should be very pleased to have me as well, because I'm missing out on the semi-final of the Champions League football tonight, which is starting roughly now. But seriously, what I thought I would do this evening is simply say something about the Good Friday Agreement, the significance of it, why it's so important, how it came to be, what its strengths and weaknesses are, its impact on the two major communities, the nationalist and unionist communities in the north of Ireland. Also, what it has been able to deliver in the past 25 years, and just as importantly, what it has not been able to deliver, and where we might go, where we are at present, and where we might go from here. I'll make use of notes which I've compiled over the last week or so when thoughts have come into my head. And I would like to leave some time, quite a bit of time maybe, for comment and questions afterwards, because I think that part of the evening is always very important. The Good Friday Agreement is a manifestation of what has become known as the peace process. But it's actually a peace process that began about a decade before 1998, and before the accord was actually ratified by referenda, both one in the north and one in the south. And in many respects, the process is continuing right up to the present time. The signing of the agreement itself was a landmark in modern Irish history, and it really did bring down the curtain on the best part of 30 years of a cycle of political violence and social upheaval. It was important for a number of reasons. It also marked the first time in what was then almost an 80-year history of Northern Ireland that a significant section of the unionist population accepted the legitimacy of nationalist and Republican ideology. Up until then, the minority community's identity and aspirations were generally regarded as being subversive, something to be discouraged and regularly repressed by the state apparatus. On the other side of the coin, the agreement saw mainstream Republicans recognize for the first time the reality of partition and concede that without the consent of the majority of people in the north of Ireland, the border would remain in place and Northern Ireland would remain British. The acceptance of the Unionist veto, coupled with the British government's previous and earlier declaration of having no selfish or strategic interest, created a completely new paradigm in which peace could prosper. The accord itself, the Good Friday Agreement, sometimes referred to as the Belfast Agreement, it codified a sort of compromise and consensus, and these are the two things that were really important about it. And wherever agreement couldn't be found, it filled that empty space with what I can only describe as constructive ambiguity. But it proved to be very, very important. It proved to be enough to actually carry the support of a majority, albeit with more enthusiasm and backing from nationalists. Something similar had happened about 25 years earlier with what was known as the Sunningdale Agreement. But that was really wrecked and brought down quite dramatically by loyalism and unionism, a strange combination of not just the unionist parties, but also loyalist paramilitaries. The Ulster Workers' Council strike back in 1974 destroyed the Sunningdale Agreement. And many of the people who were involved in the loyalist paramilitaries at the time tried to do something similar with the Good Friday Agreement. But there was too much public support on this occasion, right across the whole political spectrum. And the Good Friday Agreement was able to last. The agreement itself and the text and tone and nature of the whole agreement was conceived and developed by John Hume, assisted by Gerry Adams, and ultimately sold to unionism by David Trimble. But the deal itself needed something more to actually copper fasten it. It needed Tony Blair's young and fresh Labour administration to persuade soft unionism to accept its terms. Those who were involved in the Good Friday Agreement, like the people mentioned and many others, were considerably helped by a very proactive Dublin administration. And there was also very strong influence from the United States. And all of this came together in what was almost a serendipitous confluence of personalities and circumstances. I can't help feeling that given the people who were involved back in 1998 in promoting the Good Friday Agreement, bringing it to life, were very different people from some of the caliber of some of the people we have running the place at the present time, but that's purely a personal observation. So what was in the agreement and why was it so important? It was supposed to do two things. The first thing it was meant to do was bring an end to violence, stop the bombing and the shooting. The second thing it was supposed to do was to open up a new future of compromise and consensus in which people of both traditions could actually try to work together in a way that they had never done before. It was an opportunity for the next generation to have a chance in life, one that the previous generation had been denied. The chance of a future that would be very different from what had gone before, where children didn't have to grow up to the sound of gunfire and bombs, and which they would have the opportunity to have a new life and a better life than their parents and godparents had had before them. By very broadly speaking, this has come to pass. Any assessment of the Good Friday Agreement must take as its starting point the absence of violence. And though there have been many exceptions since, too many, including in the very same year, incidentally, 1998, the most horrific event to have taken place in Northern Ireland, the Omagh bombing, that very year. Then the killing of 2 policemen and 2 prison officers, the murder of Lyra McKee back in 2019, and the attempted murder back in February of this year of the police officer John Caldwell, all carried out by dissident Republicans. These terrible events remind us of where we have been in the past and where we do not want to return. But it has to be said that notwithstanding these horrific events, this is no longer the daily reality of life in Northern Ireland. That Bible of the Troubles, a book called Lost Years, written and compiled by 5 journalists from different political backgrounds, recorded every single death in the Troubles since August 1969. That Bible recorded 57 deaths in 1998, the year of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And just to give you an example of how things have changed, there was 57 deaths in 1998. In the 12 months to March of this year, according to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, there was only 1 death, which they said was related to the security situation. In short, there are many people alive in Northern Ireland today who would not be alive were it not for the Good Friday Agreement. So at its most fundamental and basic level, the Good Friday Agreement achieved its main aim. It stopped the killing. Rereading the text of the agreement, now some 25 years on, the sense of hope that we had at that time is palpable. Its first paragraphs speak of how the agreement offers a truly historic opportunity for a new beginning, a fresh start in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of human rights for all. Wonderful words. But as I said earlier, while the Good Friday Agreement was primarily about stopping the killing, it was also about something else. It was about building something new. For the first time in the history of Northern Ireland, you could be Irish or British, or in my case, both. I have an Irish and a British passport. You could be nationalist as well as unionist. And both nationalists and unionists could make a home where their identity would be respected and where they and their children could have a much brighter future. On another level, the agreement's particular genius was to settle the constitutional question, depending on how you looked at it. The Republic of Ireland had always claimed jurisdiction over the entire island of Ireland, and that was enshrined in Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution. Well, they were cleared out of the way. And there was then the reassurance that Northern Ireland's position as part of the United Kingdom would not be changed without a referendum. So that was a major breakthrough on the constitutional issue. For the nationalist population, the British government had made it clear that they wouldn't stand in the way of a democratic route to a united Ireland. That is still the position of the British government. Though at the time it felt very slow and tortuous, much changed very quickly, and not least the physical look of the place. And I think this is important because there was such a sense of relief that something had maybe been achieved, which, while maybe imperfect, at least opened up the way to a brighter and better future. The physical look of the place began to change. Society was transformed from a militarized society into a peacetime one. For example, policing itself was reformed. From the nationalist point of view, the much hated Royal Ulster Constabulary was replaced by the PSNI, the Prison Service of Northern Ireland. Paramilitary weapons were decommissioned, and the British Army's active deployment in Northern Ireland, which had begun in August of 1969, came to an end in 2007. Also, a devolved assembly was set up at Stormont, in which unionists and nationalists were governed by sharing power with each other, as set out in the agreement. And alongside this, there was provision for cross-border cooperation in the form of the North-South Ministerial Council, and also in terms of East-West relations as part of the British-Irish Council. Anyway, that was the theory. In practice, things turned out to be rather different. The political institutions have actually failed to function for 40% of the time over the last 25 years, with all the consequences sustained by lack of government. And the operation of the councils I've mentioned, the British-Irish Council and the North-South Ministerial Council, these have also been rather limited in what they've been able to achieve. And the most recent crisis has been down to the Democratic Unionist Party, which continues to block the formation of a power-sharing government as part of its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. The previous and earlier collapse was back in 2017, and that was triggered when the then Deputy Minister, the late Martin McGuinness, resigned his post. Now, why can this happen? It can happen because the rules of the agreement allow it, and because the structures of the agreement mean that nationalists cannot govern without unionists and vice versa. And hence the argument from both the Social Democratic and Labour Party and the Alliance Party for a reform of the agreement to remove the power of the veto from a single party so that this can't happen again. This move to break this veto would break the political impasse by allowing the institutions to be reconstituted without any party having any kind of a veto. There was probably good reason at the time for introducing the veto, because it had something to do apparently with the protection of minorities. And to some extent, this arrangement still holds some merit. But in 1998, the agreement was written on the basis that there were two major communities in Northern Ireland, that people were either nationalist or unionist, which includes sectarian terms, equates to Catholic and Protestant. But in 2021, the last census carried out in Northern Ireland, it showed for the first time in the North's history that things were beginning to change, albeit very slowly. For example, that census showed that Catholics, for the first time since the state was set up, outnumbered Protestants, though neither denomination has a majority. But also, more importantly, that 17% of the population consider themselves to have no religion at all. It also showed that the society was becoming a little bit more diverse. 3.4% belonging to a minority ethnic group. And that's 4 times the figure in 2001. And 2.1% identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or other. And in last year's political elections, the party that polled a significant figure was the Alliance Party, polling 16.5% of the first preference vote. So reform of the agreement, an argument put forward also by that party, therefore does seem rather reasonable in the light of the new reality. It's becoming clear that for some people in Northern Ireland, maybe an increasing number of people, they do not want to fit into the traditional markers of identity or choose to define themselves in the terms they've been defined in the past. But however things may be changing, some things remain the same. Religious segregation and sectarianism are still deeply embedded in Northern Ireland society. About 7% of pupils are educated in integrated schools, and the vast majority of social housing is still divided along religious lines. Sadly, there are currently more than 100 so-called peace walls in Belfast. In a report in 2019 on sectarianism, Professor Duncan Morrow of Ulster University reached the rather stark conclusion that, and I quote, "We now have to ask ourselves if the capability exists to provide solutions to these problems, or whether we must simply hope that with the passage of time, they will somehow just go away." 25 years on from the agreement, this could be applied to any number of intractable problems in the north of Ireland. It is a question with which politicians need to grapple. To put it another way, the agreement achieved peace, but it has not led to reconciliation. For all the hope of 1998, the peace dividend has not been felt evenly, and many feel that they have been left behind. In particular, one group has certainly been left behind, and that would be the unionists or loyalists, whoever you like to define them, a mixture of both, working class, who feel that in many ways the agreement had very little to offer them. It was just a matter of bringing Catholics and nationalists up to where they were. At a recent event, speaking at St. Anne's Anglican Cathedral in Belfast in January of this year, the Catholic Archbishop of Armagh, Eamon Martin, and Primate of all Ireland, spoke of the need to develop an agreed, what he called, truth recovery process to address the legacy of pain and mistrust that continue to hang over people in the North. He pointed out that reaction to what he said, it was an interesting speech he gave, was itself interesting, but rather mixed. Of course, anything you say about politics or social issues in the north of Ireland, whatever you say, is always going to be received in a very mixed way. That's what the poet, the late Seamus Heaney, once famously said: whatever you say nothing. Until some wag in West Belfast pointed out that there are many ways of saying nothing. Anyway, Eamon Martin, the Archbishop, received some interesting replies, and the one that unsettled him most was from a man whose brother had been brutally murdered during the Troubles. And this is what this man had to say to the Archbishop. He said, words are well and good. Words like draw a line, get over it, get on with your life, put it behind you, move on, forget the past. I don't dwell on the past, but I refuse to let others tell me how to deal with it. This toxic legacy will still go on long after all our family members have passed away. The word reconciliation, in my opinion, is as toxic as the whole legacy and truth and justice process. Plenty of food for thought there. It reminded me too, reading that, of what the American Senator George Mitchell, who also played a very important role in the Good Friday Agreement, when he once observed that the peace process was not just about demilitarization and the decommissioning of weapons. The bigger challenge, Mitchell said, was to decommission mindsets. Again, a challenge echoed after that by the poet Seamus Heaney. A decommissioning of mindsets, a changing of minds, a changing of hearts. In some ways, the inability and perhaps the unwillingness to decommission mindsets and to find a way of sensitively opening up the wounds of the past and allowing deep inner healing has prevented people there from achieving the kind of transformation envisioned by the Good Friday Agreement. So 25 years on, we need to keep reminding ourselves that the agreement was simply not simply about the cessation of hostilities and the silencing of the bombs and the guns. It spoke more widely about the building of a peaceful society through a restoration of relationships. The police service of Northern Ireland tell us that practically every year they record about 1,000 sectarian hate crimes. The recent attack, as I mentioned, on the Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell, and many other things remind us of where we have been and where we don't want to go back to. The security threat in the north of Ireland is nearly always deemed to be severe. Human rights and dignity remain threatened by ongoing paramilitary-style intimidation and punishments, mostly tied up with drugs, prostitution. Too many communities are still barricaded off from each other by the so-called 100 peace walls. In communities with multiple deprivation, including the highest levels of child poverty and destitution, self-harm and suicide anywhere in the United Kingdom, those very communities which were most impacted by paramilitary activity and security force presence during the conflict, there's very little in these communities to celebrate by way of a peace dividend. And talk about reconciliation. reminds me of something else that's very important. It can be very easy to simply gloss over things and pretend that things need to move on, which they do, but that maybe the past wasn't just quite as bad as we made it out to be. What is required is the sort of peace recovery process mentioned by the Archbishop, but maybe at a much deeper level. It can be too easy, as that man told the Archbishop in his letter, to use these words and bandy them about and pretend that we know what they mean, when maybe in actual fact we do not know what they really mean. And I think that was the point he was trying to make. It reminds me of what the great German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer once termed cheap grace, as distinct from costly grace. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring any repentance. Costly grace, on the other hand, is doing just that, making sure that there is some repentance. Forgiveness and reconciliation are therefore rooted in a contrite heart and spirit. But the presence of these problems of reconciliation and many other problems I've mentioned, these and many other obstacles too, has led some people to suggest, along with Duncan Morrow, that maybe we would be better off with some kind of agreed amnesia, pretending that we can somehow draw a line under the past, and wherever we draw the line, just move on. The trouble with this is that a failure to recover the truth will only continue to undermine the foundation on which true peace, justice, and reconciliation are built. It will also stifle the opportunity for genuine peacemaking and reconciliation. Moreover, the replacement of truth with a pretense or a sanitized narrative of some kind will only be offensive to all those who have lost their lives. Experience tells us something else as well. It tells us that those people who understand the past more deeply and honestly will be more likely to be open to engage in the work of reconciliation. It's too easy to say, put the past behind, forgive and forget. I remember a dear old Belfast priest friend saying that the people who are best at forgiving are those who do not forget, but remember, because they know how much forgiveness is going to cost. Wise words indeed. I'm skipping over different points here with a view to encouraging some comment and questions, and there will be other areas I'd like to develop a lot more, like the one I'm mentioning now just. The economic situation in the north of Ireland has not improved either in the last 25 years. In fact, if anything, it has got considerably worse. In terms of regions throughout the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland is by far the poorest. To give an example, I remember well, I'm old enough to remember, when people in the north of Ireland said that one of the reasons they would never want to be part of the United Ireland was because they were much better off. Sadly, that is no longer the case. The Republic of Ireland, while the north of Ireland has gone down badly in terms of economics, the Republic of Ireland has gone in the opposite direction and is now a much wealthier society in practically every area you look at. The only thing they don't have, which the North does have, is a free national health service. Let me just read this very quickly to you. In 1920, the north of Ireland was twice as rich as the south. Now the south is twice as rich as the north. The southern economy is about 300 billion euros as of 2 years ago. The north is 50 billion. The north now requires an annual subsidy from the British government of £10 billion, the reality of which is disputed by very many people. The Republic's economy is now 4 times bigger than the North's and is generated by a workforce only 2.5 times bigger. The Republic's industrial output is 10 times larger and its exports 17 times larger. The average income per head of population in the Republic of Ireland is €40,000 compared to £24,000 in the North. Unemployment benefit in the south of Ireland starts at €185 a week. In the north of Ireland, it is £58. In contrast to 1920, the city of Dublin is now 3 times bigger than Belfast, with a cosmopolitan population of about 1.5 million, which makes it the 3rd largest city in the British Isles after London and Birmingham. I could go on to mention other things here, but that's a report that came out 3 years ago. And in a report in the Irish Times yesterday, the economy in Ireland is now stronger in the Republic of Ireland than it has been in the last 10 years. I mention that because that is another issue that people are having to take on board, because the old argument that we can't have a united Ireland because we're always better off under Britain no longer holds water. And many unionists are beginning to discuss the possibility, in a way that they never did before, of some sort of federal setup in Ireland whereby there might be, for want of a better word again, a united Ireland. In recent years, new problems have been added, not least the crisis in the health service and the scars left by what has been called the legacy of the Troubles, a concept unheard of back in 1998, and also with dealing with repeated failures to actually deal with this properly, this legacy of the Troubles. Above all, and I'll come to this finally, in case you thought I was going to miss it, there is Brexit, that cataclysmic shock which has reawakened old divisions by creating a new fault line between unionists and nationalists over EU membership and subsequently over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Back in 2016, when we actually had the vote and referendum on the EU, 56% of the population of Northern Ireland voted to remain in Europe. 56% of the population. But because of this new protocol, again, this is something that could never have been foreseen back in 1998. Inter-community tensions have now worsened and positions have become a bit more polarized and hardened. Unionism feels its identity is now threatened, not just by what it perceives to be the protocol's undermining of its constitutional position within the United Kingdom, but also by the prospect of a border and the possibility of Irish unity. That's also being talked about more openly now than at any time in my lifetime. Every time I go home, I'm reading in the papers about possible to talk about having a border referendum, whether the time is now right to start talking about moving towards a united Ireland. But Brexit also reawakened what had previously been thought of as the settled question of the border. And the conversation around the constitutional change is now happening in a way that it certainly was not happening even 5 or more years ago. Within unionism, there's another problem. The sense of crisis has been exacerbated by the loss of political privilege that they had had in the North. Since the creation of the state, they have always been in the driving seat. And this culminated in last year's Assembly election, in which Sinn Féin replaced the SDLP, or replaced the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, as the largest single political party. And though she cannot take office because of the current stalemate, made a nationalist, Michelle O'Neill, First Minister for the first time in the North's history. So all of that has changed dramatically in the last number of years, and these changes I'm pointing out could never have been envisaged back in 1998. All this has challenged the constitutional magic achieved by the agreement, as does the prolonged limbo that makes it harder to argue the political institutions are working. Ultimately, I think it will only increase the arguments of those who call for an alternative, be it the ending of partition or the return of direct rule from Westminster. And by the way, if there were to be a return to direct rule from Westminster, according to the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, that would now have to include an Irish dimension from Dublin. In 1998, the hope of the agreement came from compromise, from politicians who had the vision to see a better future and the conviction to see it realised. Today, I think we feel a long way away from that spirit of compromise, from the sort of vision that could give, again, a fresh start on the basis of reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust. And yet, I have to say that the lesson of the agreement, and surely the lesson for the next 25 years, is that if we want things to change, compromise and consensus are all we have. And for all their imperfections, compromise and consensus can bring about a certain kind of peace. We have come a long way from 1998. We still have a long way to go. I've gone on for too long. I'm running out of voice. Thank you.
The thought to put into this presentation. Thank you much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed for listening. I enjoyed preparing this because it brought me back. I did have to do some homework on it, and it made me sort of think a bit more deeply about some of the things that had happened. There are lots of issues I've left out. You can't bring everything into. I'd be here all night talking about them. Like one of the most important issues I've discovered in recent times, because we found out an awful lot more about what happened at the time of the agreement and what actually led to it coming about. I mean, for example, the role of the prisoners was never mentioned. It's only in recent times we've actually been able to find out exactly how important a role the prisoners, both Republican and Loyalist, played in the Good Friday Agreement. And that was something quite new to me. I've only found that out recently, and it does make for very, very interesting reading. And there were a number of other issues I could have mentioned as well, but one can't, or doesn't have the time.
Could you say, Gerry, could you say more about the role of the prisoners?
Well, the prisoners weren't used as a bargaining chip because many of the prisoners in Long Kesh, or the Maze prisoners was outside of Belfast near Lisburn, they had served a long time and had been in for some horrific crimes. And of course, it was in the interest of both paramilitary organisations, the IRA and the UDA and UVF and other loyalist paramilitaries, to get their prisoners out. But it was almost kept a secret right up to the day before the Good Friday Agreement was signed on the Friday. On the Thursday, they were still debating whether the prisoners were going to get out after 5 years or 2 years. And the unionists, Trimble wasn't too keen on the idea of letting them out at all. And certainly, if they were to come out, they would be coming out with very, very strong restrictions. But one of the leaders of the prisoner group, the late David Irving, who himself had served time in prison, he was very keen to get the prisoners out as soon as possible with no restrictions. And he had a better understanding of where they were coming from in terms of the prisoners than Trimble had. On the other hand, Jerry Kelly, another IRA man who had served time from, in prison, he was doing the same with the IRA. And I didn't know about this until very recently. There was one bizarre incident that happened a matter of days before the Good Friday Agreement was even signed, that Jerry Kelly actually went in to meet with a group of loyalist prisoners, not wearing any kind of armour. He was lucky he was able to go in, but he actually asked to speak to David Irving. The two of them came outside of the hall, to much to the consternation of the other members of the UDA who were in the room. And Kelly said to Irving, he said, "You better sell this to Trimble right away. Our prisoners are coming out after 2 years with no restrictions. That's the bottom line. Take it or leave it." And for some strange reason, Irving agreed and said this was the way it was. He then went and told Trimble this. Trimble was certainly not very happy about it, but agreed that the prisoner's issue was an issue. And the time was fast running out. And if this was what people were happy with on both sides, then let it be, even though he had reservations himself about the whole thing. So it was just an interesting, and something we're finding out more about now about what actually happened in behind closed doors and before the agreement was actually signed. But what I found amazing was that this went up right up to the Thursday, the very day before it was actually signed. And it could have scuppered the whole thing had the Trimble not agreed to it.
Yeah. It seems, from what I understand, and please correct me, that the prisoners on both sides have been set free and there is no comeback for them. But British Army people are still being brought to court. Am I right, or have I got it wrong?
You're right in that sense, yes, you're right.
So why?
Well, I suppose it's hard to answer that. It's difficult to know. Probably the only answer I could give to that would be the fact that prisoners have always been very important in the peace process, in the sense that the guys who were serving long sentences were the people who were actually paying the price. And even whenever the assembly was set up, there was still a lot of disagreement within the Republican prisoners to the extent that they wanted to know what they had spent the last 10, 15 or 20 more years. Was it just for the likes of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness to be pally with each other? And what was this for? They had served their time for something very, very different indeed, for the removal of the British presence in Northern Ireland and the United Ireland, however you like to define those things. But there was a lot of, and that was why I suppose one of the achievements of Sinn Féin was to actually get the prisoners on board. That was very difficult, and it probably will be a testament to what Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams were able to achieve in keeping them on board, because they could have scuppered everything. If they hadn't had the support of the prisoners in trying to get rid of bring the violence to an end and enter into the political arena, things could have been very, very different. And I think that whether one likes it or not, that has been an achievement on the Republican side, the fact that they were able to move from a situation of militarism into one of politics. But even today, you would still find people, some of those prisoners, ex-prisoners, who would have strong reservations about the way things are at the present time, on the idea of any kind of an assembly or anything executive like this. It depends who you talk to, I suppose. But yes, there does seem to be one law for them and one for British soldiers. Yeah.
My granddad is from Belfast, so I've got family over there, and I'm actually going back on Sunday. And one of the things when you go to Belfast, because they're from central Belfast, is the wall, the peace walls, and you can see straight away what side that you're actually on. Do you think, and obviously Brexit has had an issue because I've made notes about that, do you think the walls will ever come down?
I'd like to think so. I certainly hope so. It's just a blot on the entire physical landscape. Even though the city itself has been rejuvenated in recent years and is certainly an interesting place to visit, and a lot safer place to visit now. But you still have those, as I mentioned earlier, about how embedded the whole sectarian thing is, and the segregation still is. It's going to take generations for all of that to change. And I think where we need to be concerned here is how children in schools are being taught what happened and about how to move forward. I think this is hugely important. There's a whole education system needs looking at in terms of how young people who are the future are going to understand the future in terms of what's happened in the past. And that's, I think that there's a lot of peace education work that urgently needs doing. And I would wonder just how much of that's actually happening in the north of Ireland at the present time in schools, but it certainly needs to be done. It'll take generations for all of this to happen. It's very easy in some ways for politicians to make decisions and change the political landscape, but the healing of hearts and minds and what was mentioned earlier about the mindset, that's very difficult, and that will take generations. There's no question about that. The only thing is, I do notice a change every time I'm home, that things are a lot better than, I mean, I've lived through all of this, and things are certainly better than what I remember when I was growing up as a child, an awful lot better. So I'm hopeful in that regard that things will continue to move along this road.
Yeah, I'd agree. Actually, it's the education thing for young people, and not be, because like I say, when you go there, on one side you've got the British flag, and on the other side you've got an Irish flag everywhere, and it is a definite divide.
Yeah.
And I think with having separate schools, I mean, like my cousins over there went to a Catholic school, and that was normal. Just to actually have one system would be better.
I am hopeful that if we get the Assembly up and running again, the executive, and that the veto is removed, that things can move forward. I mean, the key issue I hear back every time I'm home, and I'm home regularly, is people are more interested in the cost of living and making ends meet than they are in anything else. And that's the reality, as same as here. And that's taken over to a large extent. So, you know, the health situation in the north of Ireland, the health service is on its knees. The education system is on its knees. We've had civil servants running the country for the last number of years. It's totally unrealistic. It can't be allowed to continue. Civil servants aren't trained for this sort of work. That's not what they do. The Assembly needs to get up and running again. We need to get rid of the veto, as the Alliance Party and the SDLP say, and not allow any one party to stall the whole political process the way the DUP have done, and get people get some form of government up and running in the north of Ireland to address the many issues that they've got, including the health service, education, and many other things, and the cost of living and everything else. And then things can start to move forward. I think if people are fed up with the way things are at the present time, this limbo, and if they could see something like this happening in the future, I think it would unleash a lot of very positive energy indeed.
Valerie's got her hand up.
Yes.
Valerie.
So, Gerry,
Valerie,
what would be the mechanism for getting rid of the veto?
yes. Could you unmute?
I have actually.
Yeah. Well, the mechanism would be just to revise the Good Friday Agreement. 25 years later is a good time to start looking at the agreement and seeing what needs updating on it. And obviously, this veto, whatever benefit it had initially, that benefit no longer obtains, and it can now, as we see, it can now be abused. So that needs to be removed. And the agreement came out in 1998, but the north of Ireland was a very different place in 1998. 25 years on now, it's quite different in many ways, as I've tried to mention. We need to take all of that on board. So this is a good time to take stock of it and to see what has worked, what hasn't worked, what needs changing, and move forward with it. So I think if the veto could be looked at again and changed, and a number of other things changed as well, that would help the political process to move forward.
Gerry, one thing that struck me, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes.
Yes. Was the negotiations right the last few hours before the agreement was reached, but the length of time, the decades before, when the groundwork was being laid, and the importance of people like John Hume and David Trimble. But even in today's paper, I noticed that there was death of a man who I'm afraid I hadn't actually heard of, Peter Brook, who was the first, he was a Conservative minister under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and he was credited with being the first representative of the British government who would actually agree to negotiate in any way with Sinn Féin. And I had never heard of him before, but he seemed, those people far, far back had laid the groundwork out of which that Good Friday Agreement emerged.
Yeah. No, you're right. There was a considerable amount of groundwork, as I said, going on for at least a decade beforehand and longer. The Belfast Agreement didn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere. It had been carefully planned and worked at and groundwork laid over many, many years beforehand. And I think it's a tribute too, in many ways, to many of the peace organizations and agencies that were at work doing the sort of work that needs to be done that I mentioned, the healing and reconciling work, all of that. Leave the politics to some extent to the politicians, and whether that moves forward or not is another matter. But what at the end of the day really does matter is the mindset, the change in people's minds, the change of hearts and a willingness to move forward, a willingness to understand what has happened, why it's lots of organizations, and you know them as well as I do, including Pax Christi itself, the Quakers and many others, Corrymeela, all of that healing and reconciling work was vitally important. And all of that was being done years and years before the Good Friday Agreement ever saw the light of day. But I can tell you, it wouldn't have seen the light of day had it not been for it. And that's the sort of work we need to continue with from now on.
Yeah.
And work on the next generation to make sure that they learn the lessons of the past, but that they try to work for a better future for themselves and for everyone.
The other thing, Gerry, is that the comparisons we might make, or the thoughts we might take from Northern Ireland to situations like Israel, Palestine, and Russia, Ukraine, in the sense of hoping that behind the scenes, completely unknown at the moment, there is that quiet groundwork of peace building and laying the soil in which reconciliation and
I think we're frozen now.
Gosh.
I hope you can hear me. It's
Yes,
we can hear you.
quite a sort of simple, straightforward question, but I find much of Gerry's talk very encouraging, and there's been great progress. Can you indicate who you think in the next, say, 5 years will affect the change for Northern Ireland situation, and the politicians or public figures? Because one figure that stands out in my mind is someone like Mo Nolan, and it was her personality and her persistence and her knowledge and her empathy which sort of changed things. I'm not saying she did it all by herself, but she did effective change. Can you see that certain figures, public figures that you know of, you've encountered, give you encouragement to change?
I can't see that far ahead. I'm not so sure. I did mention earlier, rather cryptically, about the fact that we don't have many people of the caliber of John Hume and David Trimble around today, and Mo Mowlam now too. And incidentally, Mo Mowlam is an interesting figure you mentioned, because women politicians played a very important role too in the background, and Mo Mowlam in particular. She was an amazing individual in the sense that she had her own way of doing things. She was a very strong individual, and I think she showed people that, especially the time she went to meet with the loyalist paramilitary prisoners in the maze in Long Kesh, which was totally unheard of for someone in her position to actually go there. And for a woman to go into a place like that, and I'd been to Longkesh many times, so it was the most forbidding place to be visiting, full of macho individuals who just weren't interested. We effectively ran the prison. It's the only prison I've ever been in my life where the prison officers had to get permission of the prisoners before they went into the wing. It was simply bizarre. And obviously for obvious reasons, because you couldn't make life difficult for prisoners there, because they say, well, we know where you live, we know where your family live, we know where your kids go to school. Northern Ireland is a very small place. Belfast is a small city. You make life difficult for us, and by God, we'll make life difficult for you. So they were on a hiding to nothing. For some of the prison officers who were on a hiding to nothing. But yes, one would like to think that there would be a few
Anyone
more
else who would like
Bolans
to
down the road, coming down the path in the future, who would have the courage of their convictions and would be strong individuals with a certain vision how to do things and where things should be going, and maybe do that. But we just have to wait and see. History has a habit of throwing up people at the right time, and it did throw up people at the right time for the Good Friday Agreement. So let's hope that 5 years' time, or maybe sooner, we'll also have people who are able to carry on what the Good Friday Agreement started.
Thank you.
We share your hope. We share your hope, Gerry.
It sounds to me as though it's a sort of situation at the present time where, if you like, the logjam could be broken in quite a surprising way. For example, by what you've said about the border and the demographics. Now, am I right in thinking that those could subtly and quite surprisingly shift things perhaps in a very different direction that might be a positive direction?
Yes, I think so. And I think that would be my hope too. We're looking into a crystal ball here. We don't really know what the future holds. And it might be the case that some of these things could, on the siding, could surprise us and take us in different directions, and maybe help break the sort of political logjam that we have at the moment, because we are in a sort of a limbo situation. We're going nowhere. And maybe it does take, in a situation like that, something totally new to come in from outside and from somewhere maybe totally unexpected to break it up and start things moving again, or maybe even moving in different directions. We don't know, but I'd like to think that something like that might actually happen. I really do. Yeah. And it could.
But I want to thank you very, very much indeed for your. It was so thorough and jotting down points here as you were speaking. And I'm very glad indeed that it has been recorded, so that it's both available for us to go back to your input, but also for the input to be shared more widely on the Peace Group YouTube to access from there, because there is, you have covered so many different aspects of the agreement itself, what led to it, the positive points within it, the negatives, and although it's, as you said, it's difficult to look into the future, to indicate the points that how the present situation might resolve itself into that era, as you said, of a change of mindsets, and not just a question of change of mindsets, a true reconciliation within Northern Ireland. And I thank you very, very much indeed for, on behalf of the whole of Abingdon Peace Group and all those who were here on the Zoom, for all that you've given us so richly tonight. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you all very much indeed for taking the time off this evening to listen, and also appreciate that very much. Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.